The king, too, however, Brahma Rishi, of the Brahmana sage, say, on the shoulder, Gata Asum, lifeless, Uragam, snake, Purusha, in anger, Vinagachan, while leaving, Danukotya, with the front of the bow, Nidaya, by placing it, Puram, palace, Agata, returned. Translation: while leaving, the king, being so insulted, picked up a lifeless snake with his bow and angrily placed it on the shoulder of the sage. Then he returned to his palace. Purport: the king thus treated the sage tit for tat, although he was never accustomed to such silly actions. By the will of the Lord, the king, while going away, found a dead snake in front of him, and he thought that the sage who had coldly received him thus might be coldly rewarded by being offered a garland of a dead snake. In the ordinary course of dealings, this was not very unnatural, but in the case of Maharaj Parikshit's dealing with the Brahmana sage, this was certainly unprecedented. It so happened by the will of the Lord. Translation: while leaving, the king, being so insulted, picked up a lifeless snake with his bow and angrily placed it on the shoulder of the sage. Then he returned to his palace. So this continues the response of Parikshit Maharaj to the absence of a reception by the sage who was meditating. And as we see in the previous verse, the king was very angry and it says envious, Matsara. We know that you can have emotions, and if we have anger or jealousy or whatever, that's bad in relation to other persons. But if we express that in words or we express it in actions, it becomes even worse. Here we see that the feelings were expressed finally by Parikshit in terms of this particular action. And what was that action? He took a dead snake and put it on the shoulder of the sage who was still meditating. So that was the action of insult after rudely trying to get some water from him, etc. So we see that not only he had a faulty response to the lack of response from the Brahmana, but he created a great offense by actually doing something, that he turned that into an action. His anger was expressed by this action. So out of anger, then he took the dead snake and put it on the shoulder of the sage. And of course, a snake in general is not considered very auspicious. And they may be poisonous also, but even if they're not poisonous, we generally don't like to handle snakes much. But this was a dead snake. So, of course, a dead snake is better than a live snake because they can't bite you. But anything dead is considered to be very impure. So if you touch a dead animal, then you're supposed to take a bath, or what to speak of touching dead humans, but animals or whatever, if you touch them, then you're considered impure. So this dead snake was considered not only a low-class animal, but also very impure. And he took that dead snake, and even the king didn't want to touch the snake. So he used the tip of his bow to pick up the snake. He wouldn't touch it himself. And he took it because it was impure. And he stuck it on the shoulder of the sage when he's meditating, which is like a garland on him. So this not only expresses anger, but also a little bit of sarcasm, because the snake was like a garland on the sage. And garlands are another way of respecting. So we often see that when people create a welcome, then they garland a person. And if you don't do that, it's considered to be disrespectful. So we see in the wedding ceremony, for instance, the bride and the groom, they garland each other. And when they first come into the room, then the parents and the parents-in-law, they would garland the opposite party, etc. And when a respectable person comes to the house, of course, you have to give him a seat, you have to give him water, you have to have pleasing words, and you feed him, and usually you put garlands on them. We see in the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya, you'll often see this. They would garland the devotees and also put sandalwood on their heads. It's a very customary thing to do. So this is normal reception. And if you don't do it, then you're considered to be very rather rude, or somehow it means you don't like the person or something if you don't follow these procedures. So here he did the opposite. He took the snake and put it on like a garland. So he's really insulting him by doing this. Instead of respecting, he's really insulting him, putting a dead snake on him, something very impure. So as Prabhupada remarks in the purport, in ordinary dealings, of course, people do strange things like this, but one would not expect it from the king, because we know that Parikshit was very respectful to the Brahmanas. He was he protected Dharma within his kingdom. He protected the bull. So the bull represents Dharma. And then within that we have all the varnas and the ashramas, etc. So it's the king's duty to see they're all operating properly. So though everybody respects the king, including the brahmanas, the king also shows respect to everyone else, and particularly to the brahmanas. That's his social duty as far as a king is concerned. And, of course, then we have his devotional duties, so to speak. Now, of course, the devotee is beyond the varna-ashram system, so if that devotee is exalted and he doesn't respect anybody, he's just sitting there and just absorbed in Krishna, there's no fault in that. But that's a very advanced devotee. So that's for the renounced devotee. Or we could say someone like the Python sage who was lying down on the ground and didn't pay respects to anybody or whatever, or like Jad Bharat. So even if the king comes, he doesn't really respect him or anything. But that's a very high position. So normally the devotees are operating within the varnashram system, and usually they're grihastas. So they're expected to follow the rules, even as devotees. So we see Lord Chaitanya and his associates, they observed all the rules of that society. Instead of saying, oh, we're all beyond this whole system, transcendental. Let's follow the rules. So they follow the rules of Varna and Ashram quite strictly. So they follow that social system as devotees also. Reason, of course, is that it supports bhakti. Now, our acharyas distinguish the two things quite, we can say, emphatically, that varnashram is not an anga of bhakti. Varnashram does not directly produce bhakti, indirectly, or if it's favorable or whatever, and there's some elements of bhakti in the varnashram system, but it's bhakti that produces bhakti. This is the final conclusion. Devotion produces bhakti, or mercy of devotees produces bhakti. And we see how Lord Chaitanya in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, he would often denigrate the varnashram system when the Madhvas were speaking to him in Udupi. And then he asked them, what is the ultimate goal in life? And they said, follow the varnashram. And he said, oh, no. He didn't agree with that. Or with Ramananda Roy. He said, okay, what's the essence of everything? He says, follow the varnashram. That's all external. Tell me something else. So we see there's like a kind of a rejection of the system, but that doesn't mean a literal rejection, because you see even Lord Chaitanya followed that system. He followed the conduct of a sannyasi. And then he wouldn't talk to the king, even if he was a devotee or whatever. He refused to associate with King Pratparudra because the life of a sannyasi is governed by certain rules, shouldn't speak to materialists and whatever. So And similarly with all the other devotees, they followed that system. So therefore one, even as a devotee, one usually follows many of those rules. But he's at liberty, of course, to avoid or transform those rules which are contradictory to bhakti, like worship of demigods independently, for material gains, because that will contaminate the bhakti. So in any case, he doesn't reject. So Parikshit Maharaj was a great devotee, but he was accepting the role of the king within that society by the desire of the Lord, and he acted in that capacity, and therefore he should have followed the rules properly. And we see here completely different, the opposite. He did something that you would maybe expect from a low-class person in society, not even what to speak of a devotee. And of course, as a devotee, apart from Brahmana and whatever, and the caste system, and respecting a Brahmana because he's higher than a Kshatriya, and he was meditating, he was on a spiritual level, he's called Brahmarshi here. He was a Brahmana, but he was also a Rishi. So he was quite elevated. He was not just a Brahmana in name only. He was actually practicing something. The devotees, of course, also have, apart from varnashramic rules they follow, of respecting the Brahman or whatever like that, then they have the general rules. So we see it in bhakti itself, we recite this prayer every day, Shishashtaka, 8 prayers of Lord Chaitanya, and there he says that we don't expect respect from others, amanina, manadena. We give respect and we don't expect respect. And this is, fundamental to chanting the holy name. So that is part of bhakti also. So we do have these qualities of not expecting respect and giving respect as constitutional to the process of bhakti itself. So just as a devotee, apart from varnashram, why would Parikshit disrespect another person? And Prabhupada said, tit for tat. Sage disrespects me, I'll disrespect him. Why would a devotee do such a thing? First of all, why does he crave respect? Because he's amanina, does not expect respect from anybody. So why should he expect a sage to respect him as a devotee? It doesn't make any sense. And otherwise, he's supposed to respect all others. So why would he insult the sage by doing this? Just any living entity. Why would don't afflict any living entity? But why does he afflict the sage who was meditating on a spiritual level? So we have a general anga of bhakti among the 64 angas. There's one, don't disturb other living entities. That's prani. Anything living, don't disturb it. Don't afflict them unnecessarily. As a rule of bhakti, preliminary, the first 20 angas of bhakti are preliminary elements called the door to bhakti. And so before we chant, before we worship the deity, or bow down, or do sravanam, etc., we have to follow this rule of respecting all living entities and don't interfere with them. So we see it's quite constitutional to the process of bhakti itself to respect others and don't interfere with them, don't cause them problems, and don't expect respect. And here we see the opposite. A great devotee, but then he's looking for respect from the sage. Please respond and respect me by giving me some water or whatever. And then he harasses him by putting a snake around his neck. And very, very odd conduct. So both in terms of varnashram and in terms of bhakti, it's very contrary to the nature of a devotee or someone in the varnashram, but very contrary for Parikshit, who was a very great devotee, and who was the king, and was setting an ideal example of both things. How is it possible? So therefore, the conclusion is, Prabhupada, it happened by the will of the Lord. That was Prabhupada's conclusion in this purport. This is the only explanation for it. Of course, that is not mentioned directly in the verses or whatever like that. They don't often do that, just go on with the story like that. But that's the purport. So this is understood, of course, it's a natural conclusion. And our acharyas also say the same thing. They understand that Parikshit does not have any fault, and therefore this has to be will of the Lord. At the very beginning of Bhagavad Gita, and the introduction, I believe it is, maybe the first chapter, Vishnu Chakravarti there, he's talking about this and says that, and Arjuna falls into illusion and throws down his bow and refuses to fight. So that he says, well, this is the will of the Lord. It's not Arjuna's fault. It's not that Arjuna really has cowardice or confusion, doesn't know what to do, etc. Because we see contrary statements. We see, on the other hand, that Krishna says that he's with Arjuna all times. They're eternally related. In fact, they incarnate also as Narayan. And so they have eternal relationship as Krishna and Arjuna. And he's the friend. They're friends, very close friends. They see each other and speak to each other face to face. Therefore, Arjuna cannot be a conditioned soul. He cannot be illusioned. In fact, he's Nityasiddha, perfect devotee. So how can he fall into illusion? How can he say, I'm confused about my duty? So, the answer is, will of the Supreme Lord. It's a desire of the Lord. So, then let's explain why the Lord desires that, so that Bhagavad Gita can get spoken. So, and of course, why should Bhagavad Gita get spoken? To give benefit to all the people after that point. That is the people of Kali Yuga. Krishna appeared at the end of Dwapara Yuga, and then this conversation between Krishna and Arjuna, this becomes the message for all the people in the future. In other words, to benefit humanity, Krishna put Arjuna into an illusion so that people of the future could get benefit. And that is the same principle that operates here. We don't expect Parikshit to fall into illusion and become angry and insult the sage in this very grotesque way. So it wasn't his fault. Why? So that Bhagavatam could get spoken. Finally, the end result is that Parikshit fasted for 7 days after the curse, and then Sukadev Goswami manifested and spoke the Bhagavatam. So in other words, end result was to benefit the people of Kali Yuga by the Bhagavatam. So previously it was already stated that, because the question was there, what happens when Krishna disappears and he takes Dharma with him? So the sages are saying, well, now Kali Yuga is starting. What's going to happen? No more Krishna, no more Dharma. So what do we do for the rest of Kali Yuga? 436,000 years. So then the answer is given. Srimad Bhagavatam has risen like the shining sun to illuminate the darkness of Kali Yuga. So therefore, for that purpose, to manifest the Bhagavatam, Parikshit did this under the will of the Lord, got cursed, and then Sukadev spoke to him. So Sukadev, of course, is said to have absorbed the Bhagavatam from Vedavyas. Vedavyas, of course, to say, manifested the Bhagavatam and spoke it to Sukadev after he returned to the ashram. But we see that Sukadev was silent, and he was walking around everywhere, not speaking to anybody for a long period of time. And then when he came to that assembly, and Parikshit asked the question, what should I do at the point of death? Well, then Sukadev spoke finally. Just like Jadbharat, he didn't want to deal with the material world. Decided I won't speak to anybody, won't even deal with my parents, won't follow instructions of father or whatever thing. So they treat him like an imbecile, and they put him in the fields as a scarecrow. And then finally he got offered up as a sacrifice to Kali even by some dacoits. Still, he didn't mind. And then he was walking on the road one day, and the king's soldiers picked him up and put him as made him carry the palanquin of the king. And then the king began to insult him because he wasn't carrying the palanquin properly. And then finally, Jadbharat spoke. Finally he spoke. So he spoke to someone who was insulting him. So he enlightened King Rahugana. Finally he spoke after being silent all of his life. Then at a certain point, because of his mercy, he was merciful to the king and began speaking. And that becomes the subject of the 5th canto, where his teachings are there. So similarly, Sukadeva was like that. He was silent, walking around, and the villagers would make fun of him, thinking he was a madman, throw things at him and whatever, like that. But when he met the qualified person who would ask the proper questions, then he would speak. So that's how Bhagavatam was manifested. So Parikshit was not faulty because Sukadeva Goswami was willing to reveal all of his knowledge, but only to him. So he's not a faulty person of this material world. He was very, very exalted also. But in order to do this, then this whole event had to be arranged by which he would start fasting, etc. So, therefore, all a will of the Supreme Lord to do this, not the fault of Parikshit himself. So, the Lord does this for a higher purpose. And we can't criticize Parikshit, nor can we criticize the Supreme Lord. Oh, why does the Lord put them into ignorance? So the answer is, it isn't ignorance. The ignorance that we criticize is the ignorance of the material world, whereby our free will, we reject the existence of the Lord, and we think that we are independent. That's our ignorance. That's the one that's criticized, that type of ignorance. So it arises from our choices. This ignorance is not the choice of Parikshit due to not recognizing Krishna and whatever like that, because he saw Krishna in the womb. He was looking for Krishna all of his life. He was a devotee of Krishna all of his life. So that wasn't that type of ignorance. So the Lord can limit the awareness of an individual so he doesn't see certain things. That means ignorance. But it's not the same type of thing. It's not by the will of the jiva to enjoy independently. It's by the will of the Lord for the Lord's pastimes. And what are the Lord's pastimes? To produce bliss for the devotees. So that's the difference. The ignorance created by the Supreme Lord through Yoga Maya is for increasing the bliss of the devotees and the Supreme Lord in terms of pastimes. So that's how the Yoga Maya operates. Quite different from the ignorance of the material world. So we have the Mahamaya that operates within the material world, and it creates suffering for the jivas. And we have the Yoga Maya in the spiritual world that creates bliss for the devotees and the Supreme Lord. So we can't criticize that type of ignorance. So sometimes it sounds a little bit strange that there can be ignorance in the spiritual world because it's pure, there's no contamination. It is not like that ignorance, it's different. Similarly, we have ahankara, which is a reflection of that ignorance in the material world, called false ego. And I think I'm so-and-so body, etc. But we do have an ahankara in the spiritual world also. But it's not a false ego, it's the real ego. I am the servant of Krishna. So I have a particular identity with a particular body in the spiritual world as a servant of the Lord. That's a type of identity also, but it's called ahankara also. Because ahankara literally means a sense of I, who I am, identity. Aham kara, to identify yourself. So we have a spiritual identity. Nothing wrong with that. It's the false one in the material world, based upon our ignorance that I'm independent of the Lord, I have my material body. That is the one that creates the problem. So, therefore, we have the ignorance in the material world, the ignorance in the spiritual world, the ignorance, false ego in the material, false ego in the spiritual world. Similarly, we have forms in the material world, we have forms in the spiritual world, actions in the material world, actions in the spiritual world. Happiness and distress in the material world, happiness and distress in the spiritual world. But it's all different. Because in the spiritual world, it's all based upon recognition of Krishna. So, therefore, we can't criticize the Lord or the devotees. Purge should not be criticized because the will of the Lord that he limited his knowledge and whatever. And we can't criticize the Lord for doing it because ultimately the purpose was to reveal Bhagavatam, to give bliss to the devotees in the material world, and particularly Kali Yuga. So therefore, we've never criticized the will of the Supreme Lord in acting like this. Any question?
Speaking to somebody presenting the philosophy, explaining about eternal happiness in the spiritual world. And sometimes you get the response said, well, if I was always happy, it'd be boring.
Oh, so that's why we have rasa that creates what we call distress, separation, anxiety, worry, depression even in the spiritual world, which creates variety within that bliss. But it's all concludes in bliss. It doesn't end in tragedy like the material world. There's a mixture here, and of course they say the same thing. We can't be always happy, we must have the distress also, but then often you get the distress and you don't get any happiness at the end, so that's tragic. And there's no final conclusion of happiness, but in the spiritual world it concludes in happiness, and that so-called distress is only an aspect of the happiness there. So that's the difference. But it's not boring. It's this mixture there also. Yeah. So that's why rasa itself is not the same as the bhava. So we have, let's say, madhurya bhava, and we have madhurya rasa. So madhurya bhava is the positive aspect. But if it's all by itself all the time, it would be boring. Just having a loving relationship in conjugal rasa of a gopi to Krishna. We love each other, we love each other, we love each other. That's all it is. Or sakya rasa, we love each other as friends. That's called the sthāyi bhava. That's not the rasa. That's one element. Then we have the other elements that mix together, like the sattvika bhavas and anubhavas and vibhachari bhavas, etc., vibhavas. And that creates the rasa. It's like sugar. You just take sugar all day long, you're not going to like it very much. You like sweets, but if you just eat sugar, you're not going to like it. But if it's mixed with chocolate or whatever, or it's mixed with milk and whatever, then it gets some variety, and then you like that. It's delicious. So the rasa itself is a combination of that main loving relationship plus the other things, and that creates the bliss within there. Part of which is that variety where you'll get contrary elements appearing. So we'll get a little bit of worry, anxiety, whatever like that, and that increases the ultimate bliss of that rasa.
So the Srimad Bhagavatam reader mentions like when Gopika eventually gets to Goloka and he's just seeing that Krishna's repeating all these leelas
over and over.
It's been done before.
Yeah.
So I guess that's like the Yogamaya ignorance.
They don't realize that it happened before. Or the other way we can take it is each time it occurs, it has some new element in it that makes it superior, so much better than the other. You don't realize it happened before because it looks so different because it's ever fresh. It's just like the youth of Krishna or the youth of Radha and the gopis is this Navayovana, and it's ever fresh. So even though you could say they get tired of looking the same all the time, they don't, because it keeps on being ever fresh. It's always new whenever they see each other, that youth. And similar to the love, anuraga is said to be, the element of anuraga is it's always fresh. Each time it's experienced, it feels completely different.
Why it's not written directly that it's actually Krishna's arrangement for Parikshit to learn and behave improper? Why is it hidden?
It's not always hidden. But within this, the story is being told here, so therefore they just continue with the story. and then we're getting the commentary of Prabhupada here. So sometimes later on, the sages may ask a question and then Sutta will reply, or in case of Sukadev, he will say something and then Parikshit will say, why is it like this? And then he'll start explaining something like that. So sometimes the explanation is there. One of the, for instance, in relation to the Rasa Leela, Parikshit asked, the Rasa Leela, I said, how is it that Krishna can do this and run off with all these gopis who have married, they have husbands? How can he do that? So he asked a question like that, right there. And then Sukadev answers. He gives an answer about this, that, the Lord is faultless, and whatever he does is beyond our material realm, so we're judging from the material point of view, but it's on a higher level, so he's never criticism. But we shouldn't imitate it. We cannot act like such an exalted person. We simply follow their instructions. So sometimes we do get explanations within the text itself, because there are questions raised sometimes like that. But nevertheless, by context, we can come to the proper conclusion, even with our own intelligence, but it's clarified by the acharyas. So that's why we also need the opinion of the acharyas, the commentaries of the acharyas. So by context, as I already said, we understand that Parikshit was a great devotee. He was also a great king. So then how could he do this? It doesn't look possible. Maybe we expect a low-class person to do this, but not a high-class person, and not a high-class devotee. But so it's very unexpected. So then the only resort is that it must be the Lord's will. It could not be his thing, his fault or whatever like that. Yeah? Okay. Hare Krishna.